you read about in the newspapers is terribly frightening. It's almost invariable that you see something in the newspapers about some nation arming or thinking about getting the bomb. How did you, as a family, get involved in this demonstration that you were involved with, where you got arrested?
For me, I have to look back 10 or 11 years to the time when my middle son, Kenny, came home from a day at school in which they were teaching about the nuclear arms race. He was 16 or so at the time, and he was shocked to discover that the world hung on the brink of annihilation. And he said, "Dad, we may not grow up. What are you doing about this?" So I began to work on this problem, first through the American Psychiatric Association, which had a task force that was formed in 1977 to look at the psychosocial impact of nuclear developments. And little by little, starting with studying the effect of the arms race on children, and gradually beginning to look at the deeper psychological forces in human beings that drive the arms race itself, I became more and more convinced that some kind of change in policy, particularly in the way we in the Soviet Union conduct our relationship with each other, was needed. And I've written a good deal on the subject. I've been involved in working with other groups, physician groups, more policy-related groups on this problem. And the decision to become arrested was a kind of advanced course for me. It was a natural outgrowth wanting to take some more decisive personal action and making a fuller commitment for myself. And I can't speak for the others in the family. I called up the boys who were in their 3 sons, Danny, who's 27 now, 26 at the time. Kenny, who was 25 now, was 24 in June, and Tony, who's 23, who's now in Nicaragua. And each of them, to my surprise, was, without considerations, ready to do it. And then we all kind of put Sally on the spot. I don't think she'd felt quite ready to do it, but Sally, you have to.
I was going to say,
how did you decide?
I went from a beginner to advanced course, just like that one.
Instead of waiting, you jumped into the water.
Right. I actually had been the support person at home. I let John and the boys, each in their own way, do these things. But when I saw that 4 of the 5 of us were going out there, I thought I really want to join this group, and I was really stirred by their readiness to drop what they were doing in their academic life and in their work situations, and there was no way I was going to stay behind. And when John and I went out, actually you and I were just going to support the boys. We were not going to get arrested. But what happened to us, as we joined hundreds of other Americans out there in that 115-degree heat in the desert, and heard people talking about why they were there and prepared for this, which I must remind everyone was nonviolent civil disobedience, very much in the tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so on. The inspiration of others and the awareness of what was at stake here, and being in the desert, which was so beautiful and yet so sinister, knowing what was going on right under. We camped out on the desert floor the night before, and I just felt so close to the whole situation that by the time we were ready to go, I changed from being a support person to being one of the ones, and the 5 of us held hands and got arrested together.
The boys were ready to get arrested.
Absolutely.
They were committed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, because it's really an enormous step for a professional, and both of you are professionals, to make that kind of step, because you jeopardize your lives. Your professional lives, anyway.
There really was nothing more significant. I mean, our existence is what this whole thing is about.
Sure. Well, not too many people think of it in those terms. They're thinking about dollars and cents rather than being able to survive in a world that's essentially hostile now.
I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about direct action, because there is something about the tangible physical experience that prevents you from covering over that underlying terror and just attending to business as usual. You really have to then think about what this is when you're there with other people who are addressing the issue.
The other people who were there, were they professional people or a conglomeration of...
Total cross-section of humanity. There were very elderly people. There were some quite disabled people there who had trouble walking without their canes after they were handcuffed. There were secretaries. There were mothers who couldn't bring their children because you can't really bring young children to this, but they wore placards, you know, with their children's pictures, and one of them showed a young child on a swing, swinging up and her hair flying back, and the sign said, "Let Megan live." It was really very moving.
So there's also a very specific educational purpose in this, because the Soviet Union had stopped nuclear weapons testing a year and a half ago in the summer of 1985, and our government had resumed testing in March of this past year after a short period of not testing, and we were very troubled about this, and it didn't seem to be getting sufficient public attention. So partly this demonstration was against the testing of our country in the face of a cessation of testing on the part of the Soviet Union, and it had the specific result of calling attention to this fact, and a great deal more publicity has attended that that fact.
How'd you get involved, Dr. Zeitlin?
Well, I think it's an issue which is a combination of personal and professional. Actually, I had, I think personally just had concern about the nuclear arms race that I harbored privately, occasionally thought about. Things in the paper would stimulate it. Never really thought about committing professional time, but then became aware of the work of Dr. Mack and other people kind of studying adolescence, and in a way that gave some legitimacy to my own thoughts, and was part of a process of my starting to talk with other people and making a decision to commit some professional energy to it. And the professional piece is I'm a family therapist. I work a lot with families, especially with adolescent children. And one of the things that was emerging as some of the initial surveys of adolescents came to light was that lots of kids, say half the kids roughly in the samples, stated that they were quite concerned. They felt endangered. They felt their futures threatened. But it was not apparent who they were taking these concerns to. And my curiosity got perked up to the extent that adolescents may have also been harboring it privately, and that my sense is that people do think about this issue but keep it a good deal to themselves. So in my work, being kind of attuned to the idea of family secrets and how much secrets it can lead to a kind of distortion of experience and occupy a lot of energy, I got interested in actually talking with whole families and seeing what actually happened when teenagers and parents started to deal with this issue together. And that was really the branching off place for the work. The personal side is something I want to share too, because I think, when one is in touch with the idea that it's really existence that's at stake and kind of our children's futures, there are some personal pieces that I think also led me to feel that I wanted to commit time, and one of which is I remember being given the book Exodus to read when I was a teenager by my mother, and not that we talked a great deal about it, but when I became aware of the Holocaust during World War II, I think one of the personal lessons I took from that was to wonder, gee, why didn't people react earlier? Why did they go along with business as usual? Why were they so afraid to give up something in light of such a great danger? And I remember as an adolescent being ashamed, being outraged, being angry at everybody, the Nazis, the Jews, and vowing in some way internally that I never thought would really come to fruit in my life, that I wouldn't be silent when faced with some kind of challenge like this. And I think over many many years, I've come to see the nuclear issue in a somewhat a similar way. I mean, I understand that there is a rationale of deterrence, and that, in fact, we're not going to eliminate the idea of deterrence tomorrow. But I think there is a real need to speak out about the dangers that exist and not be mindless about it. And so that's an important personal conviction. And I'm sure it's a way of paying back my mother for giving me the book.
Well, she did a good thing. She started you in the right direction.
Yeah, she planted a seed that took fruit much later. And in some ways, that's how I think about the conversations with adolescents and their parents. That is, certain things get brought up, and it's not clear what the immediate impact is, although the adolescents always say they feel quite relieved and pleased to have a chance to talk about it. But I think there's chance for...
What you brought up before is interesting, because if you look back at the disasters, the major disasters, people tended not to pay attention to them until they happened. If you look at Nazi Germany, for instance, you know, the Jews could see what was happening. They chose not to pay attention to it, and consequently they were swallowed up. I think the same thing happened in Rome. The same thing happened in every disastrous area. And I think if we don't pay attention to what's going on with the nuclear weapons and the proliferation, we're going to be caught up in the same kind of thing eventually too. Because some cuckoo is going to push a button. And that's the problem.
You mentioned before about teenagers and adolescents being concerned about this. Is that the age that they really get concerned, or do children at really younger ages get concerned with this?
Well, there are numerous studies. Most of the what would be considered statistically valid and significant studies are of adolescents. It's an older age group. I think there is ample evidence in that age group that kids are quite aware. Our colleague Dr. Shivian has an international study that is that he's published, but there's going to be a kind of an additional set of data that he will be publishing soon, which shows great concern among adolescents as one of the greatest worries, and this is across cultures. There is also among the adolescents, especially in this country, a good deal of pessimism that their efforts or the efforts of others, adults, are going to make a difference. Interestingly enough, higher than in the Soviet Union. There's a pessimism here that people can do something meaningful to prevent it. And in the absence, there's a couple of studies that document just very little talk with adults. In the absence of communication with adults, I think those kinds of fears and pessimism can become, have a negative impact on development, can be discouraging. My own belief, and I'll talk a bit more about the book in a bit, but my own belief is that there's something greatly salutary in talking with adults, because in fact having good models for facing difficult challenges, I think, is inspiring to adolescents, and I think they do marshal their caring and their commitment, and I don't think it's the bombs themselves that are mobilizing to anybody. I really think the mediating variable is how the culture deals with it and how adults deal with it, and it can become an inspiring challenge with the right context. About the issue about younger kids, my colleague Dave Greenwald has actually done the work with younger kids. I wish he were here because he's more fluent on it. Well, he wrote it with me, and he has the chapter on younger kids. I think that probably elementary school kids are quite aware of the existence of a nuclear threat. I would say starting often at age 7 or 8, definitely by age 10. We have a wonderful quote from a 10-year-old who was asked if his friends knew about the nuclear threat, and he said, well, yes, unless they don't have a TV or a radio or don't go to school and don't read a newspaper. So, I mean, clearly kids are exposed to this in many ways. There's a Superman comic that was done in 1985 where Superman encounters has a nuclear nightmare, and he has a pretty large following among elementary school age kids. So, the issue again is that I think younger kids do think about it. I think their information is quite distorted, and again, the problem is that they don't have a chance really to get it straight and to get information straight, and especially between ages 9 and 12, I think just getting the story straight about what the bomb is and who has it and what deterrence is is very important to get the facts.
The disaster at Chernobyl, did that have any effect on how children are reacting now to the nuclear threat?
Well, I have there is a way in which I think we respond to things as a society, and kids do for a while, and then unless there is a way to pursue it, and again in some context where adults are talking with the kids and there are projects or ways to think about it, I think things recede into the background. So I think initially there was a good deal of concern. And there is a history of concern about nuclear power. My own sense is that it also is easily forgotten. That there is a way, unless the right structure is there to kind of keep hold of the experience, that things are dismissed. I mean,
this is what happens. You see, people tend to forget very easily. I think it behooves us to keep it in front of the public all the time. What was the result of your whole family going there and getting arrested and spending a very uncomfortable time, I'm sure, in the jail, which is, this was in the Las Vegas area, was it? Not very comfortable. What was the end result of that?
Well, we haven't reached the end of the result of that.
Okay. What was the interim result?
One of our sons chose to spend 6 days in jail, Kenny, and for him it was a very profound experience as a privileged kid who began to see experience the helplessness and the profound difference between the people in the jail who felt that there was little that they could do about it, and the opportunities that he has, in which he's always stressing to be active, to try to make a difference. And he's become for him a serious student. He was on his way to being a serious student, but he's become even more determined to understand what the whole economic and political structure is that keeps this arms race going, realizing that simply to demonstrate in the desert by itself isn't going to move the whole war system, which is what in your opening remarks you indicated that we're talking about a whole system of war making that is goes back from the beginning, and we simply now have devised instruments that could end us all. But the way in which military force is used not simply between the two nuclear powers, but is used by the dominant empires on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union, to control or to keep their dominant position in relation to other countries through not necessarily direct political control, but economic leverage and economic dominance. And he sees the nuclear situation as simply part of this larger situation. I think we all do, and as we've come up against the fact that for me, I hadn't really thought about it so much until you asked this, but it's made me think about the whole system of that creates the weapons. Part of it is what Steve and you were both talking about the passivity of masses of citizens who simply leave it up to the experts. Then you have people whose jobs depend on it, who say, well, I'm opposed to it, but my livelihood depends on working in this defense industry. Then you have experts who think they can fine-tune deterrence to make it a real science. And then you have people who are driven by what I call the ideologies of enmity, which is who see the Soviet Union as demonic, and no amount of expenditure can be withheld if it's going to push those terrible Russians to the brink. And you have this whole set of economic, psychological, political forces that keep this thing going. And for me, it has made me want to study the problem in greater depth. I also feel that involving ordinary citizens en masse in this is an essential part of bringing about change. And I've been very excited that Sally has become interested as a social worker and beginning to involve families, to do some organizing of families, because I think that there are just many pieces of it that the further you go into it, the more you see that this cuts into the fabric of our whole psychological being and the institutions that we've created to handle disputes between nations.
Oh yeah. Well, before you can get into disputes between nations, you have to ameliorate the disputes in the country between the people. What came to mind was what the blacks did down south with Martin Luther King, and they really made a change. They did it. People got out there and they did it.
Absolutely.
And this is where the root lies. The people have to get out and do it. You can't depend on other people, because after all, we're in control of the other people. We elect people to Congress and elect people to run the government for us. It's up to us to elect the proper people. Unfortunately, as you said, then it's a job, and they have to conform to what the job demands of them, and they change. Even the most honest politician has great difficulty getting along in Washington.
Let me tell you a story about that. I have a colleague, Jack Rowena, who worked on the technology of the early anti-ballistic missile systems defenses,
Yes.
the sort of pre-Star Wars time. And he was one of the people that he was a consultant to that task force I mentioned, the American Psychiatric, and he's one of the people that has encouraged psychiatrists to get involved in this, because he meets with the policymakers and he says, not that they're crazy, but this thing is crazy. It makes no sense. It's out of control.
Sure.
So we were talking the other day, and he said, what's really so complex here, or so difficult, is that a lot of people, and Jimmy Carter was one of them, they come into office, or they come into the nuclear establishment, as he called it, and they say, well, we don't need all these weapons. We don't need to have thousands. Six nuclear bombs going off in a country would be a disaster beyond anything known, and we have thousands of these instruments. He said, but if you go into the nuclear strategic community and you say that as an outsider, they don't pay any attention to you. You lose your credibility.
Sure.
You're not part of the game. You're not talking the technical language of deterrence, in which the weapons seem to be carrying on this abstract battle with each other. So your choice is either to pervert your own thinking and begin to start thinking that way and start playing with these numbers and these technical terms and counterforce and acronyms and abbreviations, or you get out. And very few of them get out, because then you lose your job and your position and your career and your future. So the thing has a kind of perpetuating dynamic about it. So I don't have a great deal of faith in the notion that this thing is going to be changed from within the nuclear establishment. That's why what ordinary citizens who are not caught up in this, what Bob Lifton calls nuclearism, this sort of attachment to this whole gamesman dynamic of nuclear weapons.
How do you change it from the outside, though?
Well, what you were saying, you have to become engaged in the political process, and this is where the families come in. I think that most people have left this problem to the technocrats, the experts, the people with special knowledge. This is military, after all. The ordinary people don't get involved in military matters ordinarily, but suddenly we woke up around 1979, 1980, which is, I think, the point to date the current modern involvement and concern with this thing. People woke up and they said, hey, the new people coming in, they're talking about winning nuclear wars. They're talking about it. You're ahead if a few people on your side survive and nobody survives on the other side. You've won the war if, never mind that the Earth is irradiated, but if there's something of your industrial capability left, never mind that there's no food, no agriculture, no water, you've won the war. Well, people were shocked about that. And the current period of activism, which was led by the physicians movement, and particularly by Helen Caldicott and a few other pioneers, has reached a receptive public in this, and I think that the beginning to reach mainstream America, to reach families, not people who are activists by nature, but see that there's something wrong about all this. This is what I think Steve's work and what Sally's now becoming more involved in is about.
There was an interesting movie out in the last couple of years called War Games, which I think made a statement in just that direction, because it showed the mentality, in a broad sense, the mentality of the military. It showed the fact that a computer which was able to learn was smarter than the people and finally decided that no, there was no winner. There's never a winner to a nuclear conflagration. Absolutely none, because both sides are decimated, and then you start again as cavemen.
There was also a teenager that grew up in
There's another thing too. So it made the
had
statement.
the sense to see what was going on in that situation.
Well, of course, he didn't start out by being involved. He wanted to
No.
play games.
He came by accident upon this horror.
But he did sort of, in a sense, save the world because he prevented the confrontation that the military was planning. You see, but this is unfortunately not too far afield from how the military thinks.
But you mentioned before about the Russians desisting the testing, and that the Americans have not. What if they do, and the Russians? I mean, can we trust the Russians?
Well, this is the
Isn't there a fear of we
question.
stop and they
Why are they such villains?
Well, they're separate questions. The dislike of the Soviet system, or the tendency to blame the Soviets for all of the problems. I mean, the Russians have contributed substantially to the view that we have of them. After all, the Stalin period was horrendous, where they killed millions of their own people, and they subjugated Eastern Europe after World War II. And there are many great numbers of refugees of the Soviet system in this country who are so deeply affected by their experience in Eastern Europe that they can see nothing but a demonic, evil empire. So the president speaks to many people when he talks about that. And on the other hand, this hatred of the Soviet Union, this demonization of them, overlooks certain basic facts. For one fact is that the only, in terms of U.S.-Soviet invasions, the only real invasion that ever took place was an invasion that we did of them in 1917. 1918, 1919, after the Bolshevik Revolution, a fact that is generally not familiar to most Americans. Also, most Americans don't realize that in the nuclear arms race, it is we that have led at virtually every stage in the technology and in developing advanced systems. It's always thought of that we're reactive to the Soviet system. Not so. We've developed several new first strike capable weapon systems recently, and the Russians do not have a technology to match the Star Wars system. Never mind that it won't work. It still scares them that it might give us the sense that we were safe, and might encourage us to be adventurous. And yes, they do have defensive systems, but they have no technology that can compare with this, and they're afraid that they'll feel forced to try to play catch-up with this, and it's going to bleed them economically. But Herbert York, who used to run the Livermore Labs, has acknowledged that one of the weapons labs, that it's our technology that drives the arms race, that keeps the momentum of the arms race going. So that the Soviets and their threat is always used as the rationale for what we do. But if you look at it carefully, where the real momentum in the arms race comes, it does not come from the Soviet Union.
That's right. And I don't think it ever came with any arms race, except from the country that was aggressive to begin with. They're the ones who started this thing. You start all the proliferation of arms, And of course, you're right. We started. We had the first A-bomb. We exploded the first A-bomb. It's still a good question in a lot of people's minds whether or not that was a useful thing to do, because I think the war was waning at that time anyway. And of course, there would have been a lot more Americans perhaps who were killed during the war, but I think the war was winding down. By that time, Japan was running out of steam. And in fact, at that time, they were giving shock treatment with bare wires, rather than machines that didn't have them. So that it may not have been necessary, but it certainly was a grand gesture to show the world that the United States is in control. And and of course the Russians didn't have the technology, but they stole it. They do it all the time. They have a very good system of espionage. So that they're not that far behind. I don't think they're certainly up to us in technology, as you say. But,
I'd like to just kind of address from the perspective of the study of ordinary families a
Yes.
couple of these issues. I mean, that is this segment of of the population that I've looked at, and our interviews were purposefully with families that were not involved in activity, political activity on this subject, because I think we wanted to understand how ordinary people thought about it who hadn't been moved to some kind of action. And it's a lot of stuff to summarize. Can I plug the book?
please,
Okay.
Sure. Just hold it up and we'll.
Okay.
In fact, if you give it to me, I'll
Okay,
hold it up
good.
and get it. Which camera are we going to do? That camera. Okay, good.
This is a book based on interviews with 25 families
Okay.
discussing the issue of the nuclear threat. And there's a chapter on young children, on adolescents, on the impact on parents, which we paid lots of attention to because we saw that as a very important aspect of it, and a couple of family chapters.
No reason to talk about it.
Yeah, well, we kind of considered the issue taboo, and as one, that's actually taken a quote from one of the teenagers, a 14-year-old girl who we interviewed, who at the close of the interview, when asked how she felt about the conversation, she reminded us that politics really didn't interest her very much, but she was glad that some things had gotten out on the table. And she said there had been no reason to talk about it and nowhere to say it before this. And the interesting thing with this particular girl, we did follow up some of the families 4 and 5 and 6 months afterward. And the particular girl who gave us that quote in the first interview just said she really didn't care at all. She lived for now. And when we came back and showed her the clip of herself that had been taken 6 months earlier at the point where she said politics doesn't interest her, she actually stopped and said, well, that's not really true. I just feel helpless and useless. And, what that told us is it kind of should let the issue in some way. And, I think there are ways in which everyone either kind of minimizes the vulnerability that this elicits or puts it off in some ways as they initially begin to come to terms with it. So one way we've thought about these discussions is a beginning of initiating a process of coming to terms with, being able to come to terms with the issue. And certainly one impact of discussion was that the adolescents, when we followed them up, had been thinking about the issue a lot more. Families were not, in the context of this kind of research, moved to political action at all, but there was a lot more digestion and thinking about the issues. But I'm kind of getting long-winded. I wanted to come back to the point about a couple of important aspects of the family process. That is, what immediately struck us was how difficult these conversations as a family were for the parents. That they had given, by letting us come in and talk with the family, I mean, they had asked their children whether this was okay. It was always a family decision, but they had taken the leadership and the initiative because we always ask parents about the possibility of doing this. So in a way, by taking leadership, they encouraged their kids to talk and put stuff out, and that is what happened in a good deal of cases. But I think the parents did not feel well prepared to handle concerns like that some kids really thought nuclear war was very likely. Some other parents had a hard time when kids said, I don't care. I mean, but that the issue itself seemed to really point out to us a lot of parental vulnerability. I mean, that seemed to be the best word to describe it, that when faced with the idea of needing to protect and provide for the next generation, it's very assaultive to parents. And that it seemed to us that adolescents felt quite relieved by having the exchange, but parents often went away quite unsettled, I thought. So we paid a good deal of attention to that. And what we noticed is at the moments when some new information came out, potentially points of learning where for instance, a 14-year-old girl had been surveyed at school and the family knew, but no one had ever asked her what was on the survey about nuclear weapons. And in the interview, I asked her, and she said, well, they asked if we thought there'd be a nuclear war before the year 2000, and I asked her how she answered. She said, I said, yes, I thought there would be. And the parents responded quite strongly. The father kind of winced and said, oh, I feel squeezed by this. And But then a process began, and this is coming back to the issue of can we trust the Russians? It's a long way there, but that is, a process began where the parents started to debate whether one or the other of the parents was too optimistic or too pessimistic about the whole issue. That when this information came in that they felt kind of, I think, really affected by, there was a kind of a debate about whose parenting style was better, whose way of doing this was right, and a blaming discussion went back and forth. What we noticed is that seemed to happen a lot, that the vulnerability is so intense that it elicits a lot of blame. And I know there's a long history of our enmity with the Soviets and opposition to communism, but based on the study of how ordinary people think and deal with this, I think there is something about the vulnerability of one's existence being threatened, one's culture, one's children, that is so powerful when one initially takes it in that there's a tremendous tendency to blame. And then unless one has a structure and a situation where they can keep talking about it and thinking about it over time, one might just stay there with a simple, well, you can't trust the Russians. It's an easy way to deflect the vulnerability.
That's right. That's right. You know, because that goes back, way back, you know, when they first started the Soviet Union, back at the time of the revolution in Russia, because, and before that, they couldn't trust the Russians because of the Tsar. The Tsar was not particularly trustworthy, and people heard about what was going on in Russia, so they felt that it was a whole different kind of society than what we had. And I think this gets back to basic issues. If there's a difference in societies, then you tend not to trust. If somebody is different than you are, you tend not to trust them. And this is unfortunate because this is human nature. And this happens most of the time until you begin to realize that they are people just like everybody else. And then you begin to meld into one society. But anything different is frightening. And you know that, all of us know that, I think, that anything different is frightening and sets up a system of thinking where they become threats. And of course, then when we developed something that was potentially destructive to the whole world, we became a little bit defensive about that. And then when the Russians got it, we became very frightened. And I think this is what went on, you know, a little bit here, a little bit there, and before you know it, you've got a whole one society against the other. But the fact is that we're all people. You know, somebody once said, if you took all the clothes off soldiers and they put them in the battlefield, nobody would kill anybody because you wouldn't know who was the enemy. Right. Because the fact is, everybody looks the same. The trouble is, we don't all think the same way. I still think, and as I said before, that people are the ones who are going to make the difference. And I don't think I have the nerve to go out and get arrested, truthfully.
Well, I wanted to say, Well, I wanted to say something about both what you're saying and what Steve was saying, which was that we had a really powerful effect in our family that has happened in other families too who have acted together. That's the opposite of this arguing among ourselves. Namely, we felt tremendously empowered together. And one of the things I was struck by is what a healing force that is in a family. Basically, we get along well with our kids. We're not a fractured family, but we have some very strong areas of disagreement about certain things.
They're bright kids.
And they're bright kids. They're assertive. You know, they care a lot about what they care about, and they're very independent and don't necessarily do things my way. But one of the things that was so moving about this was that we were, number one, we were totally together. No one's issues, no one's narcissistic whatever was more important. There was a cause beyond ourselves. And that we really did care about each other. Kenny was the one who stayed in jail, but we all, you know, wrote to him or made sure he had books or carried his backpack for him or whatever. And I really, one of the reasons I have started an organization for family action in the nuclear age, I think it helps give children the models that we were talking about. It's a sense of pulling together as a family. I kind of had the feeling this is what it must have been like for the farm families in the early days. If you didn't all do your job out there, you weren't going to get food the next season. And there was something about all pulling together, all having a cause beyond ourselves, and that the pettiness of our lives was really much, much less important.
See, this is the basic of group dynamics.
Yeah.
See, what you're seeing is really what happens in the group.
Let me pick up on that for a minute and speak a little bit as a psychiatrist, psychologist. I'm not sure which.
Here we are.
That's what your program is. And look a little bit more formally at the resistances that people have to getting involved, because I think there are of two basic kinds. There are the ones that we're familiar with as psychiatrists and psychologists, which are the resistances we have within ourselves to not want to think about anything that's too painful or frightening,
Sure.
and we avoid and we deny and we stay away from the difficult, scary things, and certainly the threat of nuclear war is one of those. But there's the other kind of resistance, which is a little bit less familiar to psychiatrists, which is the resistance that comes from not wanting to seem odd in the group, not wanting to stand out. Sally's mother was, I don't know if she'd mind my saying this, but her mother says, why did you want to go and stand and you know, stand out like that by getting yourself arrested? You know, people are afraid that they'll be criticized. Most people are not very active on the nuclear issue, so they don't want to be seen in their jobs as an activist. An activist is, even though there's a noble tradition with Martin Luther King, and Thoreau and leaders in the civil rights movement of Gandhi, whatever, of action, still people generally stand back, and they don't want to separate from the group. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to think of themselves as too political. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to be criticized at work. Maybe they won't be promoted if they make too much noise in the office and carry banners or are active. So that's a kind of resistance that has to do with our identification with the group. That's why it's so important to create groups like Sally's talking about, where the group is a support system, where it's acceptable, where ordinary families across the spectra of society are all involved in this, so that the one that stands out is the one that's not involved, that it becomes acceptable, that silent majority, if you like, feel that it's okay to become involved, that it's legitimate. It's something that the family down the street is doing. They're talking about it. They're becoming involved. It's what you do in a democracy. You don't leave it up to the elite, to the technocrats, to the people with special expertise. So I think that's it's that group resistance that you can overcome.
I think
with this
that's
kind
a
of
really
work.
important message, and the message of the book is that positive message, that there really are things people can do. You know, beginning with breaking the silence and talking with each other about it. And, you know, I've only begun to think about the kind of family action that you're talking about, which seems very...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just that there are many levels of activity, you know, from the kinds of thing of connecting with counterparts abroad, or, you know, bringing it up in one's professional group, or political petitions that come along. I mean, there are ways to begin to mark out and come out of the closet about caring about this issue, which is what it felt like for me when I first did. I mean, I experienced exactly what John's talking about. I started to ask my friends about it. Did they think about it? I felt quite embarrassed. It wasn't an easy thing to do. And then I found that others, I didn't feel so crazy. They thought about it, or they had their particular ideas of why it wasn't so important. But
The more people can do that, then.
Right, and they don't necessarily have to do something as dramatic as getting arrested. I mean, they can go on a family vacation to Washington and go as a family to their congressman's office and say that they're concerned about this, or they can write a letter as a family. The children could write at their level, and the parents could write at their level and send a group letter. I mean, there are many things you can do as a family, but the family bonds really do give you a chance to look at the scary stuff. Those are the folks, you know, you can depend on to back you up when you're upset.
Well, I think, you know, the family group is very important, the family unit, because if you act as a family, you have some clout behind you.
Yeah.
If you act alone, then the rest of the family is against you very often, then you don't get the impact.
Or isolated.
What about the family, though, where the children are a support system and the parents are not? I know I would have been the only one in my family, and I feel just as you do. My parents never would have been a support system with me.
Right. Well,
what happens there? I mean, what can they do?
Well, first of all, I don't think it has to be the total family or forget it. And as a matter of fact, I was really able to face my terror and my association with the terror, which I came to realize was about the Nazi Holocaust, that kept me from even getting involved, but standing there with my kids. Of course, I have not teenage anymore, young men in their 20s, but I think even when they were younger, they've often enabled me to look at things in my own personal development that I wouldn't have been able to face if they hadn't confronted me on it. But furthermore, I think that sometimes, for instance, it's just a three-generational thing. I've known of a child with her mother and her grandmother doing something together. A lot of mother, daughter, parent, child, groups have done it. It isn't necessarily both parents and all the children, or it can be very elderly people. And one of the beautiful groups there were the elderly people who were out there in the desert with us. They were just, I don't think too many of them got arrested, but you also need support people in any system like that too. You need people who are helping you with water and keeping track of you and your belongings and stuff. So,
when you and Steve were talking about the Nazis and you talked about reading Exodus, I didn't really think that much about it. I mean, you learn about it in school and you hear about it from your parents and your grandparents, but when I saw Holocaust on TV, it literally changed my whole life. I feel different about everything, including the nuclear threat, because of that. I was so moved by it. I just cried through that whole thing, and my one question after I saw the whole, it was in a series, as you know, is why? Why didn't anybody do anything about it? We have to do something about it.
Why do you think that got to you then, more than hearing about it or reading about it in other ways?
Because nobody did anything about it before. Because it happened without people getting involved beforehand.
Sure.
I mean, I felt a personal, the whole, it really changed my life. It was devastating for me to see that.
It's amazing the power of television. Television reaches people. What they see makes an impact. If you listen to radio goes in one ear and out the other, and it's gone most of the time. Television sticks with you because the visual image that our brain really retains, and that's why it's important that we get across to the people who are listening to us tonight and watching us tonight something about this. We can get people moving, not necessarily in the sense that you did things, but at least being concerned.
Right.
That's most important.
Actively
concerned, yes. I think that to feel it, I mean, first you do have to feel it, but sometimes even by joining some action, you allow yourself to feel it more fully. I think that's one of the things I was so struck by for myself.
Groups very often send flyers out asking for money. People don't want to send money. They just don't want to do that. And this is and I've spoken to a lot of people about this. They don't mind getting involved in a sense, but they don't want to send any money. And the action groups need money in order to function.
They do.
Well, that's another way of being active, I think.
Underwriting what they do.
I want to tell you about something that just happened to me. I was thinking about the difference between the Nazi Holocaust and the present Holocaust that's threatening. And one difference is that the reason for this one being the Russians seems to allow a lot of people not to think much further. Well, we have to have these for the Russians. But then you think about, well, what do they really know about the Russians? What do they know about Russian life, Russian intention, Russian families, Russian lives? Very, very little. I just came from something called the Entertainment Summit. This was a meeting organized by Mark Gerzon, who's a producer of a small company, a production film company in Hollywood. Got the idea that the media are themselves ignorant about each other, the Russian media and the American media. So he brought the leading Soviet filmmakers and the leading American filmmakers, some of whom were involved in things like the America series, to talk to each other and to commit themselves to creating realistic images of each other's societies in the public media, in films and in television. So, because how are we going to learn about each other if the media are involved in distorting the other for commercial purposes, political purposes, whatever, for ignorance purposes, whatever. So this was an effort to get accurate, full-bodied, realistic media information through films about Russians. When they show Americans, they'll take the trouble to learn something about Americans. They won't just show us as the greedy capitalists. And when we show Russians, we're not just going to show them as these evil creatures that are trying to destroy our way of life and take over our capitalist system. The public has to be educated, not just in the schools, because that's very terribly important that children learn realistically about the Soviet Union, and education about the nuclear issue and about the Soviet Union is very, very important. But also the public media, like your own program and other, that will show, when they show, the television and film show each other, that we show each other honestly and truthfully. And this could do a great deal to reduce the tension and the fear and that you were talking about
That's wonderfully
earlier.
high-minded. I wish we could do that.
But I think it's beginning to happen.
Well, I hope it does. I hope it does. But generally, it won't sell. It doesn't make money for these filmmakers. They have to produce something controversial, or something that produces a strong emotion, like hate. And that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. This is what sells movies and what sells all kinds of television productions. It's not presenting the public with something that's real. If people would think of the Russians as other people, they could perhaps then have a stronger bond. But they don't think about that. You see, they think about what the image is that has been set up for them. And America in particular, showed the Russians as both sides, a little bit as both sides, but not so much the kind and generous, but also the cruel part.
And the evil people back in the Kremlin.
That's right.
But this entertainment summit involved a major commitment on the part of leading Hollywood directors and actors to move beyond that hateful stereotype.
Oh, I'd like to see that.
Well, one concrete example, I think, of Ted Turner and his network has devoted a great deal of attention to exploring the Soviet Union and bringing this issue to light. And I think there's a way, that it hasn't yet dawned how much this has seeped into the fabric of American society, real concern about this and awareness about the nuclear issue and the need to try in different ways. Because I certainly don't think of Ted Turner as a radical or even a liberal, but Billy Graham. I mean, there are other public figures who you wouldn't think of in that light who've devoted a lot of concern. And so there are certainly models for people from very different walks of life to look to as a way to try to break the stereotyping.
Sure, and physicians have done so. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War were a Russian and American physician. Educators for Social Responsibility are bringing programs into the public schools, and children really do learn about it. I'm not as discouraged about it. I guess I've been.
Well, I'm not discouraged about it, but I'm just thinking of.
You're saying there's a lot to work on. There's a lot to work on.
Be done.
Yeah.
Speaking of doing, I wanted to give people two telephone numbers that they can call if they're interested in pursuing this. One is for the elementary course, which is to call the Center for Psychological Studies in the Nuclear Age in Cambridge, and there's two numbers for that, 497-1553 and 497-1554. And the center has educational materials about the arms race, particularly with this psychological family dynamics-oriented kind of approach. Papers of Dr. Zeitlin, my own, other people who are working on this issue, and they will be able to steer them for other information that people may want about the nuclear arms race itself.
And if people at home didn't get that number, we'll have it at the studio here, so they can call after the program or tomorrow or next week, and we'll have the number here.
Let me give it again. It's 497-1553 or 497-1554. And those numbers are to get information about what's available for them.
Yeah, it's about this whole human psychological dimension about the arms race, for educational materials, research materials.
Very good. Very good.
And the other number is people who want to go on to the advanced course and get involved in some of the actions in Nevada and Washington that are coming up in April to, in a sense, speak with their feet and their bodies as well as and souls as well as their minds, to call Dr. Lester Grinspoon, and his office number is 277-3621, and he will tell them what's happening, who to
About
contact.
American Peace Test.
And about American Peace Test, which is the name of the group that has organized these demonstrations in Nevada and also in Washington and Boston, too, on August 6th. There was.
Are they going to protest a testing in Nevada?
Yes, there's one in April that's protesting, and there's a Mother's Day demonstration in Washington coming
And there
up.
are also demonstrations at the Department of Energy, which, believe it or not, some people don't know this, is that branch of our government that is funded to do the nuclear testing. is our Department of Energy in Washington. And so one of the things the American Peace Test did in November was arrange for a barricade of the Department of Energy offices
3 Mile
there.
Island was theirs, and
Oh yes, the whole thing.
But the weapons themselves.
No, the weapons thing.
The weapons
not
themselves.
the
The
weapons.
weapons labs are financed by the Department of Energy.
3 Mile Island, I'm not sure.
See, this is so important to address this because I didn't know that. I'm sure people watching at home
Right.
don't know that, and I think just having all of you on this program tonight is enlightening. Because I've learned so much tonight, and as I said before about Holocaust, I don't take things lightly anymore because of that. And this program is a good example of that too.
well,
That
you're intense. You
I'm very intense.
When she gets involved, she gets involved.
That's it,
Good.
totally,
Good.
200%.
Which is very good, but most people unfortunately have not even had the initiative to get involved.
They need the support of other people.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think the isolation
They need
is the
information,
single
too.
biggest
Isolation
problem.
is the
that,
toughest
there's
part.
great strength in feeling supported by other people, knowing that they care as well.
But the support is there. There are so many groups. I mean, if
Well,
they call our
okay.
center, we can tell them any
That's
number of
right.
groups that will suit their particular needs and provide support. And there's a kind of excitement and a feeling of real exhilaration that can come from taking advantage of this democracy that we have.
Well, as you
And,
said before, it's the democratic process. And that gets back to the
Yeah.
founding fathers.
Right,
We, the people.
right, right.
And if we don't speak out, we don't get anything in this country. In fact, we go down the drain. So it's very important, I think, that people do get involved.
and the Russians do respond. I mean, people say, well, the Russians won't respond. When John Kennedy unilaterally stopped the atmospheric testing, he had an understanding with, was it Khrushchev at the time? That,
Yes, it was.
that he would stop, and he did stop, and that's how we got atmospheric testing. The Russian record on the big things,
Yes.
go back to the trust question, has been as good as our record in terms of violation of treaties and sticking to the basic points of treaties. People need to know that because that's not what they're told often by governmental spokesmen.
Well, I rather doubt that the Russians want to start a nuclear war. I rather doubt that. Well, I want to thank you very much for a very interesting program. It developed into something
Great.
that I think is certainly imperative for people to know about. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for being on.
Well, thank you
Thank you.
both for doing this.
Yeah, yeah.
We really
Appreciate the
it.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Very much so.
Our guest next week is going to be Dr. Larry Samet. I don't know if you know him. And we're going to be talking about